So a couple things have started me to think about this video, Psychotic 3, part of a series on understanding the psychotic or near-psychotic experience in today's culture, particularly both at the individual and the collective and organizational, institutional levels. As an educator, therapist, leader, sacred warrior, I'm interested continually in when we get so far off reality and being able to stay connected to reality, we slip into a kind of hypnotic state of trance in an unconscious way, a negative creating way, a fear-based way, onto this path of the psychotic split from reality. I'm stirred up particularly by a couple things. I'll mention the first one very briefly. The second one will be a little longer about why I'm so troubled of what's happening in our education school system as a mirror for what's happening in our society and the world generally. So I'm not going to attack schools here. If you're concerned about that, I'm not going to get down and, schools are so violent, so bad. Well, but it is about violence. So let me just go back to the very first stimulus for this video. And I can only mention it because the Stephen Jenkins is a very interesting speaker today, a very interesting wise elder. I'll put a link to his work below. Stephen Jenkins worked in what he calls the death industry, and he was actually trying to build a really healthy death culture because of working in palliative care and so on and so on. He's got a long bio. You can check it out. He's got many books, many videos. So he was interested in the wisdom that death can bring to our living now and then living into death. He's not the only one that's been interested in death and dying, as you know, Kubler-Ross and many others before. But he is a very unique voice and has a very fearlessness-based psychology in terms of life in relation to death and dying. So because I promote and have for 30 years plus of fearlessness psychology, philosophy, theory, model, praxis, on the way to the liberation path, to love in its true sense. Stephen Jenkins talks about, because we're so death phobic, the death industry has fed and bred and made a lot of money and made a lot of careers on basically more or less not really dealing with death and dying as a very unique and an amazing process. I know there's been some changes. Death doulas are now coming and growing and as a profession and other things, but on the whole, that is so minor. On the whole, he is an expert in the death and dying process and this death industry and its pathology. So here we are, trying to learn to deal with death better, so-called in the death and dying world, or helping people suffer less and so on, all these virtue signaling kinds of notions and bringing safety to the death process, bringing love and healing to the death process. You can see I can get a little bit cynical, but it doesn't mean everything's bad about it. Yeah, but when you listen to someone who's spent most of their life in that industry, becoming not a healthy death culture to this point, and the massive negative impact that's had, I highly recommend Stephen Jenkinson as a fearlessness thinker for our time. Leave that at there. He basically does end up saying we're pretty sort of psychotic in still our relationship to the meaning of ends, our relationship with ends and limits. And he's speaking particularly about North American culture and the modern world. All right, well, I'll turn now to the next focus of this video, which is on what stimulated me was watching recently on CBC News, Canada here, the 3-part series on the problem of bullying. And I would say in my career, I've probably watched, dozens of these. There are hundreds of these programs that media love to pick up on, and that then school boards will do some kind of anti-bullying campaign or some kind of change in policy or something, right? Schools representing such a major part of our socialization of our society, our learning, at least in the formal and very important developmental years as we preschool, kindergarten, on up. And I'm going to particularly focus on just K-12. So remember, I'm a professional educator myself, several degrees in education, as well as in counseling and therapeutic kinds of directions. I've thought education and therapy are one and the same in many ways, and they are distinct too, yes. So the CBC got into a really standard, out of the package to traditional, very predictable kind of review of what's going on in schools. Other than, give them credit, they dug up and found school boards were more or less hiding a lot of statistics, as were schools, not wanting to share them with CBC in their research for this programming. Some schools did, but a lot didn't, and they also felt this amazing resistance as journalists to, hey, stay away from what we know about our school. We're a great school and blah, blah, blah. And you get all this imagery and all this virtues signaling of how safe our schools are. And look, they look at the reporting, which is actually expected and legally schools are bound to in a lot of districts, not all. And even that, because they're bound to record, does not mean that they record accurately. And that's what CBC found. They found a lot of holes, a lot of gaps, a lot of inconsistencies and contradictions. Schools reporting, for example, a great number of them in Ontario. And again, I'm not a statistics person, but you can watch that CBC. It was yesterday, was their 3rd episode, which is interesting that they basically showed that schools are still operating in a culture of fear because people don't want to actually tell the truth. It's dangerous to tell the truth. The school could get a really bad reputation if it told the truth about how many actual violent incidents happened, and how do you then define violence, and why don't we define violence as hurting? Let's record all the hurting that goes on in a school system, in a school day, in the school grounds, in the life of the child that we supposedly care and love so greatly and want to protect so wonderfully, all those great virtues. But the reality underneath is there's a whole lot of lie goes on, and deceit, and for good reasons. As I said, a lot of it, school reputation, principal reputations, teacher reputations, professional reputations, and not wanting to be punished for actually having many incidents or even some in their schools. Of course, schools can't avoid all violence, and many violence gets really bad. And that's what I call the psychotic part of the safety initiative. So here's the quick sort of formula for how to define a psychotic education system, in my view. In the Ontario schools, this is what was reported on the CBC program. The role, which I call the ideals of schools. In Ontario right now, they said on CBC radio, the journalists, that they're written in their code of policy, if not law, is 1, keep kids safe. That's the first ideal role of schools. And the second one is educate kids. And Now, if you think that prioritizing there is a little weird, or if you think, oh, that's just great, I can see both of those perspectives. It is great. And it is important that we keep kids safe. But when you put that before educating kids in our schools, our public school system, it tells me just how much fear and the feeling of not being safe, being fearful, is controlling the entire policy making of an entire education system. This, again, happens to be Ontario. You could probably find this in many other. There's a long literature going back to the early 1990s in my research of schools without fear, fear-free schools, safe schools, and all those kinds of things. And I've always been a critic of it for not the surface of it, which is kind of a mother and apple pie kind of statement or claim. Let's keep kids. We love kids, so let's keep them safe. But the violence is ongoing, and the violence is increasing on many people's radar systems, including Talk to Teachers, Talk to Kids, which CBC Radio, TV, did interview 4,000 kids across Canada. And this is Canada. This is not the United States. And a large percentage of kids will report. And again, they're just self-reporting in an interview. Not necessarily that's the accurate truth of what they're experiencing, but it's an indicator. You know, a really pretty high percent do not feel the school is safe and feel bullying, whether it's bullying going on or whether it's just experiencing violence or sexual abuse and so on, harassment and racial prejudice and transgender prejudice. You can name many, many dimensions of the feeling hurt, feeling unsafe. So I think that's actually it kind of tells me about the psychotic state of education right now. It's so confused and so driven by feelings and emotions and a kind of emotionalism, which is not to negate that emotions and feelings aren't important. I'm a fearologist. I totally think those are important, and I defend them every time I can as experiences. But experiences of emotional feelings, etc., are not to be, as far as I'm concerned, a rational way to understand how to build policy. And that the reason is because in trying to create safety, these schools have actually become unsafe because they're trying to create a picture of being safe. And that's what CBC Radio found out, TV. And more or less concluded. They didn't say it quite like I'm saying it. You could watch that series yourself or watch any programs on really anti-bullying programs, research, and so on. And it's this real weird, as I say, split kind of reality of this trying to be so safe is actually making the situation unsafe for kids. Because there's a lie going on. That ideal of safety, you cannot even keep that ideal of safety in a family home. I worked with kids. I worked with teenagers. I've worked in family therapy. No. Kids often express, they feel hurt by their peers, that they feel hurt by watching one parent hurt the other parent. I could go on and on. They feel hurt by parents, feel hurt by teachers, feel hurt by society, all kinds of people and things that go on. Children today feel hurt because of the way adults have not solved or taken enough action on climate change, and they feel their future is completely compromised. You don't think that hurts kids? It gives them a sense of diminution of their value. You see, it's really a deep, deep hurting going on, and a deep fear that goes with that hurting is that, I'll be hurt again if I risk. If I stand up, I'll be hurt again. So there's a lot of silence and a lot of not telling the truth, and of course there's the threat of telling the truth or snitching, as it's called in the whole bullying field. That's why kids don't report, or women often don't report rapes or children and so on, sexual abuse. And so any time you get a school system trying to put safety first, and of course they know they need to work on it, they know they're not perfect, but they're actually putting that first. And rather than saying, well, we really need to learn about, and this is what I would do, I would say, well, of course, I'm not going to be invited into these conversations. I've tried for 30 years to get into these conversations on school violence, and nobody's really that interested, or period, they're not interested in my approach and my angle of a fearlessness perspective, because they want to use a fear perspective. And I'm saying, no, let's actually learn about violence, hurting, and where it's going on and how it's going on, and let's really listen to it. Not just in schools, but I'm talking really our whole society and our family systems. Well, our family systems and our society and our schools are pretty, quote, pathological, because they don't really want to know how much people are hurting within those systems, including a workplace. But they'll use the rhetoric of, safe environment. We'll put up the sign of the color bars, transgendered or LGBTQ queer people are safe here. This is a safe space. All right, so it gets to the problem of attempting to create safety at this kind of obsessive level that's so fear-driven, because we live in a culture of fear. This is not just an individual problem. This is a culture that's breeding its own neuroses and psychoses constantly, and then trying to pretend that it's not psychotic by saying, no, we're so dedicated to fear and love. Book after book, article after article, curriculum design after curriculum design. It's not the experience for the most part. And there's more and more experience, as that CDC research showed in schools. And really severe cases of abuse are going on, and including, some really severe situations that they report, which again are only a small statistic, but we don't know how many are not being reported, because schools are avoiding that these things are really going on. They don't want it to come out too much. And that means including false reporting. Well, that's what a culture of fear does, and we saw the same problem in several situations over the last few years with standardized testing, high stakes testing in schools, where funding in the United States was actually impacted whether a school got funding, whether they got high grades for their students. And of course, the school boards and superintendents and principals and teachers and others colluded in some cases, and were actually fined in some cases because they were false reporting. See, this is the psychosis. You actually try to create a safety, right? Safety first, education second, and then you actually are trying to put out an image that we're safe, because then you're good, you're virtuous, you're signaling correctly, you're politically correct, and hopefully people will stay off your butt and not be investigating too closely what's going on. But then ask the real teachers and students within those systems, and there's more and more data coming out as well when people do speak the truth here and there in some research. But overall, this is the false, the facade. So the safety facade is really what I'm talking about here today. Is part of the safety facade, is part of the psychotic, near-psychotic process that is building and creating more and more chaos and danger in the world when you're detached from avoiding, denying, reframing in very false, in ways that look secure that are actually insecure. Children not feeling more safe in the actual experience would be one way to put it. When I was doing therapy, one of the things I would ask kids, or even not even ask them sometimes, I would just kind of put it out as a statement and say, well, how would you respond to this statement? So I'm kind of first meeting one of the kids in therapy. Depends on the age, but I would say more or less like this: is, does it ever confuse you that Those who say they love you the most want to create safety for you the most, hurt you the most, don't actually listen to you, don't actually validate what you experience, especially when they are saying, I'm being hurt consistently, I'm being bugged, I'm being oppressed, traumatized, terrified, invaded, denied. Are you confused by that basic thing? You know, those who say they love you the most hurt you the most. Well, I'm not going to go on in this video in detail about what I heard from people when I've shared that, including adults who I've used that as a lead for actually thinking about the therapeutic process. Because the therapeutic process is a type of trying to unwind the psychotic, near-psychotic living conditions of everyday reality. In other words, the contradiction that we seem to be in such kind of good shape here, and I'm speaking of, you know, North Americans fairly well off, I'm not just talking about those who are really not very well off at all, but our well-offness, our quote well-being, underneath it is that's a facade to me for the most part of a whole lot of denial and masking and creating image of the positive, great, wonderful, blah, blah, happy. Just go into our school systems. The violence is not decreasing, it's increasing. The hurting is increasing. More and more people afraid, more and more people pulling. Adults don't want their children in those schools. And they're trying to find, quote, the safe school, the better school. And then a lot of people who have absolutely no choice, no money, and cannot even imagine an alternative. And then just think about the actual kids experiencing what they're experiencing. Well, one of the big problems is like it kind of comes out in this question. It was a activist badge I found quite a while ago. Just to let you know, it's kind of obviously a kind of Greenpeace movement on that badge. You can see the colors, but here's what that badge actually says. Asks as a question, do we fear our enemies more than we love our children? This is a question to our entire society. I thought it was a pretty interesting question. You see the two words I've underlined there in the contrast, the contradiction. And that's, you know, do we fear our enemies more is showing, asking that question, are we out of balance with creating safety? See, that fear-based drive, obsession for, you know, safety and pure safety, right? Everything from safety panic rooms that are now being built in safety communities with walls around them and safe security guards, and schools now have all the school safety monies and things that they're putting into schools. And is that actually becoming more important than, you know, really loving our children? Or does that prove and show that we love our children? If I buy them a bulletproof backpack, does that show that I love them? Or is my fear actually dominating my love for them? And my love for them has to be part of helping them to be in touch with reality. And the reality of being hurt as part of life, as part of safety, is not pure. It cannot be completely protected. Everyone will experience constant risk. All organisms do. And part of that is Stephen Jenkinson's notion that our end is coming. It already is coming from the moment we're born. And that will be a great loss and a type of hurt and suffering to face into. Well, if you don't live a life on the path of fearlessness that faces into the end time of your at least physical demise and the great loss and suffering and all that goes with dying, aging, disease, etc., violence, then we don't learn about healing. So what I see in schools is there's no learning program for healing hurts. When hurts come, then we move to healing. So that should be our fundamental curriculum. So it's not separate, right? It's not let's keep kids safe and then we'll educate them. No, it's actually the education is that life is not safe. You can't keep a family safe. You want to try and keep a school classroom safe? You want to try and keep a whole school safe from violence, hurting? It's not going to happen. It's absolutely false in terms of the reality of life. It's actually a false system that is artificial, and it actually is against life. It's against learning in life, with life, about life. And if we're not learning about life, what are we learning about? We're learning about a pseudo life that actually is not possible to happen. Well, you want to confuse kids about that? Confuse messaging. And this virtue signaling of we're politically correct and we're good. You see, we're virtuous because we're a school that has safety first, and we love our children and we protect them. So any kind of protection narrative is my kind of final point in this video, just because I'm just barely touching surfaces, is a slippery slope and a very double-edged sword of, oh, we're children protectors, we're water protectors, we're saving the planet, we're earth protectors, we're women protectors, whale protectors. Double-edged sword in and because of the conditions of a culture of fear in which we exist. So that's my premise. And I've written lots about that culture of fear. I've written lots about it in education and the avoidance of educators to account for and acknowledge that truth and reality, and the risk, the damage of hurting, oppression that goes with that culture of fear, which has a long historical trajectory, a whole other story. And ultimately, as Stephen Jenkins say, where we live in a death-phobic culture, we actually deny that death is part of life. And that means risk is part of life, hurting is part of life, suffering is part of life. To go back to the Buddha and so on, other teachers throughout history. Not a lot of wisdom in the whole safety narrative, this protection narrative. There's good stuff in it. Don't get me wrong. If you spend time with me and my work, that's not where I'm coming from. It is to go deeper below those false surfaces of which fear creates those guises. Fear is political correctness, virtue signaling, to often hide deeper truths of contradictions and confusion. And with that confusion, a deep fear, if not terror, ontologically of what is actually real here. And so it's easier to go into our iPods or our systems of creating just busyness and franticness and images and having lots of dogs for safety, or constantly singing on the phone so that you're not alone in your confusion. Those are distractors. For the most part, they're crutches. And yes, do we need distractors and crutches sometimes? Sure, okay, maybe you do, but are you addicted to them? What are we addicted to? Or we're addicted to avoiding the fear that is underneath that which we call love. So in my last video, I said we really need to be moving to a fearlessness love, which is a recorrection of how we use love, how we use safety as part of the love care discourse. Even compassion discourse can be confusing. I think there is a true compassion. Again, I would just recommend Stephen Jenkinson on seeing somebody who's an amazing, compassionate individual of a maturity you see very rarely, and at the same time is a staunch and harsh critic of just about everything in a culture of fear, i.e. what he calls a death-phobic culture, and the denial and avoidance of reality itself, disconnected culture. pseudo-artificial worldview, as other colleagues of mine have said, and so on. Fear-based. We're out of balance, right? That fear and love. Do we fear our enemies more, right? Do we fear violence more? Do we feel being hurt and risking? Do we fear that more than we love our children to actually experience and live life as it is with all those things? Risk, hurt, violence. Well, if we actually balance those, when people are hurt, we'll teach them how to heal. So when I see that in the curriculum as the fundamental purpose and ideal of schools, would be the same for a therapeutic community or session or relationship, be the same with a loving, intimate relationship, is we agree as a very fundamental ethic referent that when we're hurt, we will move to healing and we will support that healing. You don't even need the word love. You don't even need the word care. So we've built this really disabling and dissociating and psychotic to near-psychotic coping culture over and above, out of balance with a healing culture. And as I say, a long trajectory of thousands of years, perhaps that even began, that splitting and dissociating fear-based culture of fear, dominating today. Will continue to until we say, oh, it's not a bullying problem in school. Yeah, bullying's a problem. It's a symptom. The real problem is the fear problem. Oh, the fear problem, the real problem of the fear problem is it's a hurting problem. Oh, that's because we don't teach healing when people are hurt. We don't want to spend time on that. It's not that important to us. You think it's not important to you? As we watch the rise of violence, then we will make that important. Oh, we're going to create safety. We're going to be school, violence-free schools. We're going to be schools without fear. We're going to have all this great coding. And underneath, we're not really paying attention to our value and what the real problem is. That's psychotic. That's like avoiding reality, right? Sticking your head in the sand in some kind of way, distracting or pretending it's not really going on. But we'll deal with the symptoms. So that's pretty much my focus. And if anyone finds this video interesting and wants to connect me with anybody in the education systems anywhere, I'll look forward to that, because I've certainly given lots of effort to attempting to get educators to really truly pay attention to the culture of fear dynamics, which I'm speaking about today. And that's not just in schools, right? That's in our entire society, our entire socialization process, our parenting, and so on. And moving from a coping culture to a healing culture is the same as moving from a fear-based society to a fearlessness-based, from a fear-based psychology that goes with all that to a fearlessness psychology, which I've been talking about. And just using the word fearlessness, love is another little piece of language. So I'm giving many languages in my work, and there's many languages you can learn from my work and others around who I cite and who I work with as colleagues and so on this path of fearlessness. Thanks very much for this.